Hello everyone, I welcome you all to the AD Design Show virtual. Today with this hyperlocal panel, we're going straight to Chandigarh. I know that it might seem like a very obvious choice for an architecture magazine, but our fascination with this iconic city runs deep. Our intention with this panel is to really zoom into a micro view of Chandigarh and take a look at parts of the city designed by Corbusier and his team of architects. Each of our speakers today have a very special relationship with Chandigarh. So without further ado, please let me welcome our panelists for the day. Architect Noor Dasmesh Singh joins us from Chandigarh itself. He lives and works in the city and as a local brings an insider perspective of life in Chandigarh. And joining us today is London-based architectural photographer Edmund Sumner. Over his decades-long career, Edmund has collaborated with leading architects, publishers and editors across the world. In 2017, he traveled to Chandigarh and shot a series of stunning photographs. And today he's going to share a few glimpses from his experience with us. And finally, joining us is Mayank Mansingh Kaul. A long-time friend of AD and one of our contributing editors currently, Mayank is an independent writer and curator known for his expertise in the post-independence histories of textile and design in India. He has spent years engaging with an interest in the history of the tapestries inside the interiors of the Capitol complex. So welcome Mayank. I'd like to come to you first and take our readers right into the heart of the Capitol complex and give them a peek at perhaps one of the lesser known aspects of the architecture and the interiors. We know that you've been working on researching these tapestries and are today using some images of them taken by photographer Manuel Bugo, who has extensively photographed Corbusier's work across the world. So my first question to you is that could you please tell us a bit about this research that you've been engaging in and what you've discovered over the years?
Thank you so much for having me. The iconic architecture from the outside of Chandigarh has overtaken the narrative about the city so much that as someone who has been involved with textiles in the post-independence period, I've always been slightly angry at the gap in representation about the tapestries that Corbusier designed for the Capitol complex in Chandigarh, because according to me they are certainly among the greatest tapestries in the world of the 21st century, certainly the leading 21st century tapestries in India. Concrete, which has been talked about so much about Corbusier's architecture, has always led our understanding of this modernism that was being invited to the country at this point through very, very pioneering developments and commissions by the Indian government. But often the use of color, as you see on the left, matches and complements and corresponds very, very actively with the textiles that Corbusier designed for the Capitol complex, as you see in the right image. And I think the entire experience of the architecture, the interiors of the Capitol complex, in my view, has to be seen with all of these elements together, where the textiles not only play a part in softening somewhat that very extreme and harsh aesthetic that the concrete architecture is often sort of both appreciated and criticized equally for, but in the same way sort of establishes a very long history of the use of not just textiles in interiors but as architecture itself. So if you just to draw attention to the viewers to a very long history around the world of architecture being textiles, you had the concept of tented cities. When emperors moved, often 10,000 tents moved with them, qualifying for an entire textile experience of a city. So this idea of the equivalence of textile and architecture is something that is of great interest to me, both historically and in the contemporary period. And I think this experiment or project in Chandigarh really highlights that. So just to give you again a little background on Corbusier's interest, he was invited reportedly in 1936 to Aubesson's, which is a tapestry workshop which was set up in the mid-18th century in France to actually help develop certain sketches and drawings to revive the tapestries and pile rugs that were being made there historically for the nobility. And that is when his interest in textiles really began. And I just want to read out a quote from Corbusier's diaries that actually records his interest in textiles, and I quote, "We change apartments according to the evolution of our families, successive growth, and so on. With time we alter our lifestyle, also the neighborhood, etc. We cannot have a mural painted on the walls of our apartment. On the other hand, the tapestry, this woolen wall, can be taken down from the wall, rolled up and taken under the arm at will to be hung up somewhere else. Thus it is that I have named my tapestries nomadic murals." In this slide and the next slide, you're looking at images of the tapestries that are used in the Legislative Assembly. This is where the laws are made, and we know that Chandigarh is not only a union territory, but it's both the capital of Haryana and the state of Punjab. So it's a very important Legislative Assembly. And the tapestries for this particular section of the capital complex, the Legislative Assembly, were actually made after the tapestry made for the high courts and the courtrooms, which I'm going to share later. But here we get a full expanse of how these tapestries were used. You can only imagine Indian MLAs sitting in this Legislative Assembly and discussing questions that hopefully concern the state and the country. And its mere symbolism says a lot about the beginnings of India's design history. And I like this particular detail of the Legislative Assembly because you have an image of Gandhi, which sort of brings in to contemporary and modern India the legacy of khadi, of handspun, of handwoven and the handlooms. And then along with that, you have the backdrop of these completely 21st century modernist tapestries, through which we understand the beginnings and the legacies of modernism, of contemporary developments which were having a conversation with the latest sort of currents of design thinking all over the world. So this idea of Gandhiism and Nehruvianism, this idea of large-scale infrastructure, modernization that Nehru represented, and this idea of small-scale cottage industries, rural development, which Gandhi inherited, I think is captured really well in this photograph, because this is largely, apart from the erstwhile royalty and aristocratic aesthetic that India receives, these are largely the two aesthetic currents that India receives post-independence. So I find this image quite telling in that way, and about the constant relationship of India's modernism, early modernism, with the handmade, with rural manufacture and so on. Now what is really interesting, again, just to show you a detail of the Legislative Assembly, imagine the head of the Legislative Assembly, the speaker, sitting here against this backdrop of modernist tapestries, furniture and architecture. And what was interesting about this experiment, it started with the tapestries for the courtrooms, which I'm going to show later, like I said before, was that Corbusier's atelier in France developed drawings for these tapestries, and then they were actually woven in India. And what was also very telling about the fact that Corbusier by this time has spent a considerable amount of time in India. He's done private commissions in Ahmedabad because the Legislative Assembly's tapestries get completed in 1962, is the reference to Indian symbols, coloring and motifs. So you look at the snake and the serpent here, you look at the use of colors like red, yellow, which recur in Indian historical aesthetics and art. So this sensitivity towards symbolism that Corbusier shows, and the Indian specificities that he brings into the tapestries, is one aspect of how he was sort of engaging with India, and is really expressed really well in the tapestries that we see. Another angle of the Legislative Assembly, you can only imagine the MLAs sitting here. The entire room is covered, all the walls are covered, and I request you to, for 1 second, just imagine if these tapestries didn't exist and you were staring at concrete walls. And so the importance of tapestries really in imbuing an ambience, in actually creating a conversation with other elements of an interior project and an experience, is something that is really exemplified by these tapestries, and I think is really a benchmark for the use of textiles as architecture and in architecture in post-independence India. I'm going to now take you to, on the left you see an image of the murals of the outside of the Capitol complex, and to just bring back into the conversation the sort of dialogue that the murals and its colors are having with the tapestries inside. On the right you see, this is the room of the judge of the High Court. There were several other rooms. There were in fact a total of 9 tapestries that were made for the several courtrooms, but this is the room of the judge of the High Court, and this is the High Court. And in this particular case, we have evidence, and it's been recorded that Corbusier was very careful in his use of symbols and color. Red denoting a lot of activity and this idea of justice. The starkly geometrical use of forms which has been reported to represent for Corbusier this idea of rationality, objectivity, justice, and so on and so forth. And I just find that, to have these kinds of tapestries in a space like a court is really, really, again, a great representation and represents really what the ethos of the first few decades of this kind of modernist vision in India was. It's really, really quite remarkable. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that a lot of aspects of Corbusier's architecture has been discussed from his interest in creating modular forms. And when he conceived of the sketches and these large scale tapestries, they were also conceived as modular. In fact, Corbusier was very keen that they are produced at the village level in Punjab, which had a traditional history of panjadaris or daris, carpets and rugs, which were made in a decentralized system of production in the craftspeople and weavers' homes. So what he really wanted were these large tapestries to be broken up into different pieces, to be given out to these dari weavers in their home, and then they would be put together. It was really his idea of actually acknowledging the role that traditional craftspeople could play in the production of these modernist tapestries, and at the same time suggesting a kind of praxis or a format for a decentralized form of production. So unfortunately, however, because there was a great hurry in actually completing the courtrooms in 1955, they couldn't actually set up this decentralized system of production, and the production was finally given to a private company based in Amritsar called the East India Carpet Company Private Limited, and it was produced in-house there. Eventually in the 1960s, when the production for the Legislative Assembly's tapestry started, the same company had changed and it had started being called the Oriental Carpets Company, which was now based in Delhi. So the production really happened there. But this idea of the modular is something that actually he was very keen on. He also, if we can move to the next slide to see a detail of, on the left you see a detail of the tapestry in the judge's room of the High Court, and on the right another courtroom, a detail from that. What is also interesting and what I'd like to leave the viewers with is this great appreciation for understanding what was really being made locally in India. It is something that shows an aspect of Corbusier that again is not often talked about. But also the fact which is recorded, because some of these thoughts were actually and suggestions were actually intended to be incorporated into India's 5th year plan for that period, which is the financial plan. And Corbusier suggested that this idea of the modular production of daris and carpets could actually seed a very important rise of exports from India of carpets and daris. And while it didn't quite happen in the way Corbusier had sort of perhaps thought of it originally, but it's interesting to reflect back on this intention of Corbusier, sort of again a visionary, thinking about the carpets as a very important aspect of what could be India's export, because today the production of carpets and daris, and especially handmade floor coverings, constitute one of the biggest items of handmade products from India. So I think that's just something that sort of circles back a very interesting trajectory of intentions that sort of in a way come into fruition in inadvertent ways. But for us now to just look at these extremely powerful and bold tapestries is a great reminder of really a period where, you know, an idea for Indian textiles had been thought of that could be so striking and that could send out a message for decades to come.
I thought at least it was so insightful about, how these tapestries become a portal into giving us a view of Corbusier and how he was engaging with the context of Chandigarh, and also the idea that he was engaging with craftsmanship in India itself. So that was very insightful, and thank you for that. I'd now like to zoom out a bit and explore the larger architecture and planning of Chandigarh. So while Corbusier's architecture itself invites debate, it remains undeniable that his buildings have always been very photogenic, and they've fascinated creatives for more than decades, including our next speaker, who first traveled to Chandigarh a few years ago. London-based photographer Edmund Sumner has traveled far and wide in search of his subjects, and in recent years, he's worked with an incredible list of people, which includes architect Tada Wando, RIBA, or the Royal Institute of British Architects, fashion label Burberry, and the national government of Kuwait. And he also has a new book in the works, which features his photographs, and it's called The Contemporary House India, and it's soon to be published by Thames and Hudson. We at AD are definitely looking forward to it. So welcome, Edmund, and thank you for joining us today. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey to Chandigarh and what really drew you to the city in 2017?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me and your kind words. As you kindly introduced and explained, I photograph architecture, and I photograph architecture around the world. But with particular reference, I've been doing a lot of work over the last few years in Japan, England, India, and Mexico, amongst other places. And India has always been one of my favorite places to work. And there, you're also big fans of Corbusier, who I've been sort of fascinated with, and I've been photographing a lot of projects over the years. So I first came to India in 1991. I was one of those annoying sort of hippie types you'd see backpacking around, sort of, young, dumb, and a backpack, and that was great. And then I came back to India in the year 2000 on my honeymoon, and then it was around the year 2008. There was the financial system was sort of collapsing, and some architects from India very kindly invited me over. And with one main commission, and then I chatted with some magazines who added on other commissions to that, including visiting Ahmedabad and photographing some of Le Corbusier's early projects, as well as meeting Doshi and Gujit Mataru, amongst others. Anyway, it's a wonderful relationship, and I come back more and more and more. In fact, I think some people actually think I live in India, which maybe one day I will. I don't know. Let's see. So anyway, in Ahmedabad, I photographed the mill owners and the Sarabhai and the Shodan house, and I was very taken by how these were very real, very working buildings, whereas a lot of Corbusier buildings I visited were, consultants, with, the kind of cultural police, as I'd call them. They're very, the museum-like, people with white gloves and reverent tones, where I quite liked the sort of rawness and the freshness. I also quite liked the fact that a lot of these buildings were a little bit beaten up, not perfect. They were real. So everyone was always saying, have you been to Chandigarh? And it was sort of always on my list to go. But actually it wasn't until 2017 where I actually found I had enough time to go. And so there was a few buildings that I wanted to photograph. So maybe I've selected 3 of them, which I'll talk you through. So this first one is the architecture school in Chandigarh, and it was a very, very simple, straightforward shoot. I was quite taken with the building, the sort of low-rise nature of it, but also in particular the fact that these are raw working buildings. I loved the use of colour. And I like the fact that things aren't perfect, and they get sort of used over and over and painted and repainted. So that was particularly what I was interested in these frames, and sort of showing the juxtaposition. And I was just very, very taken of this, and the sort of etchings of time, the idea of all the students who had passed through this architecture school behind. And I was just really, really, really quite taken with this frame. So this is visiting the high courts, and I tried my hardest to get access and backstage and sort of get a bit of a sort of tour, but actually it wasn't sort of possible to have any of this. So then I presumed that Corbusier buildings I'd visited in India were quite relaxed affairs, so I would be able to kind of go free range and do my thing but actually that really wasn't possible. So I was quite sort of surprised, but actually sort of quite pleased in some ways, because the buildings were being treated with due reverence. So anyway, the only way I actually managed to get around was by going on the official tour, and but in a way actually I found that visually quite liberating. I was shooting things handheld, and there's a series of pictures, and I think these 3 I think are my favorites. Yeah, so this next picture, this is probably the most sort of successful picture I think from the series. This is a picture I call the Leaning Man. And it's very interesting. It was handheld. It was just 3 frames on a handheld lens, and I think a 300mm. And there's just something about it. It's the sort of shaft of light and the play on colours. And I sort of put this up on Instagram, and it just kind of went crazy, and people were contacting me, and I began to sell prints of the picture. And I think also, I called it the Leaning Man, but there's a lot of sort of mysteries to this picture, and one of which actually it isn't a leaning man at all. It's the figure in the background is actually a lady, which I didn't realize until about 6 months later, because she's sort of in the military fatigues. And there was something else. A lot of people were referencing a photographer called Fan Ho, who I didn't know, but Fan Ho was a photographer working in the 50s up to 70s in Hong Kong. And he was very into sort of placing figures against sort of shafts of light. So anyway, I now know his work, and I think it's fantastic, and it's a huge compliment to be sort of seen in that way. But it's very interesting how the dialogue of certain pictures or what it means to different people. With Chandigarh, a lot of people were always asking me, had I heard about the cinemas? And I was like, well, no. And I'd long heard there was a particular cinema called the Neelam Cinema, and but I couldn't really find any pictures of it. In fact, I wasn't even sure if it still existed. So when I got out to India, I did my research on Google and found out, sure enough, it was still there, and it was still open. And so I went, and the manager seemed a little bit bemused, and but quite pleased, and said that sure, I could photograph it, but I could only photograph the interiors during changeovers to films. And then the changeover was usually, I think it was about 20 minutes. So really, I work in quite a slow, methodical way. So actually, I managed to get about 1 or 2 pictures during each changeover. So I was there the whole day. But actually, I quite liked that. So this particular picture, I think it's probably one of the best pictures I've taken. I think and it's just a fascinating space. I love the fact that this building is striking and bold and beautiful, but also it's dirty and ugly and sharp, and it's kind of. I don't use ugly in a descriptive sense. I use it in a complimentary way, if you know what I mean. This is not sleek sort of 3D cinema with wobbly seats and surround sound. This is sort of old school entertainment, and so I'm really quite fascinated by this space. Yeah, so really I spent about a day in the space. I would actually like to go back, so as soon as I'm able, as soon as this wretched plague goes and we're back to normality, I'm going to be back in India, and I'm going to spend a lot more time in Chandigarh. Photography is always a rush. You're rushing to do this, you're rushing to deliver files, you're rushing to do things. So I'd like to be able to sort of spend a very, very long time. And the thing is, when you're taking pictures, and particularly with scenes like this, you're aware that they are going to be in circulation and in dialogue for a very, very, very long time. So you feel a lot of pressure, because you realize that although maybe you're only there for a day, those pictures might well be in circulation for 50 years, maybe more. So it's a celebration of Chandigarh, it's a celebration of Corbusier, it's a celebration of my relationship with India. And India, you've always been so kind and welcoming to me, and so it's my sort of mission to bring Indian architecture, furthermore contemporary Indian architecture, to the world. Thank you very much for having me, and Mayank for explaining more about Corbusier and the tapestries, and I'm very interested to hear from Noor, who I've been in dialogue with more, and I'd look forward to meeting you all on the next time. We'll have when I visit. Let's go and have a beer.
Sounds like a plan, Edmund. Thank you so much. I mean, the photographs that you showed us are by themselves they're incredible. But I feel like when we get to know about these little anecdotes and backstories, it's then that the images really come alive, and you kind of appreciate it in a new light. You look at it in a new light. So thank you for sharing those experiences with us today. And now I'd like to come over to you, Noor. You've grown up in Chandigarh and really lived every day in this modernist experiment of a city. And that's why you have a very special spot on this panel, because we are very interested to hear an insider perspective of things. So could you tell us a bit about your years growing up in the city?
Sure, Ritupriya, thanks for having me over. To take you a little back in time, like a lot of young boys, I was interested in gadgets and automobiles, and I completely hated my school. My dad, being a psychologist by training, gave us a very creatively charged sort of environment. It was soft, it was organic, with the freedom to explore our own individual interests. We would all board on his white Priya scooter, and our weekend outings as kids were invariably at Sector 17 Plaza, with the iconic imagery of the bird fountain etched somewhere in the inner layers of my memory. This was accompanied with usual treats like the softy corner and popcorns and all of that. Another place that's just there with me is the aeronautical department of the Punjab Engineering College. This is where I saw larger than life defunct airplanes, and got so enamored with these flying objects that for the longest time wanted to be a maker of flying machines. maybe the seed of coming around to be an architect was sown then. If one looks back into history, objects that move and have a certain dynamic inspired the Italian futurists at the beginning of the century. Even Le Corbusier, for instance, had a romance with flying machines. For those of us who have read his book, Towards a New Architecture, connect between the two, they would know that is deep and intrinsic.
I'm also very interested to know that, how did these years growing up being enveloped in this incredible architecture and in fact the legacy of the city, and you choosing to become an architect after that. So how did that impact your practice, and was it in a very direct way, or did you find subliminally it kind of filtered into your work as well?
Yes, so Rithupriya, all influences, inspirations from the city were quite an inseparable part of my growing up years. The brutal forms, the bare grey aesthetic, and the powerful scale, subconscious, perhaps subliminal is the word that you use, they're all there with me. Years later, the same gets reflected in the practice of her work. I can see that connect. It doesn't need to be literal translation of sorts, but the modernist in us, the modernist in me, is more a way of living. It's imbibed in my worldview, it's part of my character, and almost a second nature. So starting my practice career at the industrial design studio of the IIT Delhi, and then having spent few years in London, we've carried a cross-disciplinary sort of mix of the projects forward on my return to Chandigarh in 2009. Then there is another project that we are currently on, which is the Museum of Anatomy. This is a fascinating brief. This is for PGI Hospital in Chandigarh, and it comes in a heritage zone of the current Chandigarh Master Plan 2025. Therefore, the design intervention not to be respectful of the context. Perhaps living and spending early years in Chandigarh sensitizes oneself rather naturally and intuitively towards such design situations. Moving on further, now this residence 747, it's very close to my heart. Obviously, this is a house that my dad built in the 80s, and we grew up here as children. In 2009, I started the process of renovating the space since the services had given way. It took me about 2 years to complete. And as you can see, the house was built in the quintessential Chandigarh exposed brick sort of architecture. With very minimal structural edits, we transformed the space inside, and we try to keep the palette modernist and minimal.
Brilliant. And before we wrap things up, I just wanted to ask you a quick fun question. Could you put your tour guide hat on and give us a few secret places that are your favorites in the city, and things that people, design lovers visiting Chandigarh, shouldn't miss?
Sure. Well, the first one would surely be the Capitol complex, I would say, especially for design enthusiasts. Try and go there when it's a bit cool in the evening or a pleasant day, since it's a very large open concourse with many buildings and some really breathtaking modernist sculptures like the Open Hand, the Tower of Shadows, and so on. So that would be the first, I would say. The second can be the Sector 17 Plaza with the bird fountain and the iconic structures like the Neelam Cinema. It's a photographer's delight, and Edmund has very kindly shared his set of images with us. And I think don't come back without eating the mutton dosa and the filter coffee at the oldest Indian coffee house in Sector 17. The third one on my list would be Sector 22. This is the oldest sector. Go check out the Pere Jeanneret designed Brise Soleil houses that face the market complex. These are very, very quaint and very pretty. The next one I would say could be the Government Museum and the Architecture Museum. And there is a very sweet sort of eating spot just in front of that called Stop and Stare, which serves some yummy aloo paranthas with some amul butter and Punjabi lassi. So one could delve into all that. The last one I would say would be the Gedi route, which is rechristened the Azadi Marg now. Drive down in a car or pedal rickshaw or even a stroll on a pleasant day from sectors 8, 9, 10 through to sector 11, where you're sure to spot some fashionable brigade just about doing nothing. So that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that those neat tips and tricks. I mean, I hope our viewers were making a list. And quite honestly, you had me at mutton dosa. So thank you everybody for bringing your unique perspectives. I think you don't have to be an architecture enthusiast to really take away something from this conversation, whether it was that brilliant research, Mayank, that you've conducted in about the tapestries in the Capitol complex, or Edmund, your little nuggets about sitting through entire Bollywood movies to get that perfect shot. So thanks to each and every one of you for making this a very, very special conversation. Thank you guys.